Halloween is so fun. It's so fun because you get to dress up and pretend and get candy. I don't know, would it be as fun without the candy? I'm not sure, and we don't really have to answer that question here. Young people often wrestle with which they like more, Christmas or Halloween. Indeed, it is a very fun time, and today, since it's October 31st, we have in our presence people who are dressed up as animals or superheroes or princesses or witches. There are some who do magic, or maybe you've dressed up even as a cartoon character. It's fun to pretend. And sometimes we want to pretend in ways that are a little bit bigger than one day of the year and a little bit more serious than Halloween. Sometimes we want to pretend to be someone who is like our role model. We see people out there that we say, oh, I want to be like them. And in the church, we have role models. I want to introduce you to a couple of them through a slideshow. Vida Scudder was born in Massachusetts the year that the Civil War began. When slavery had ended, everyone was figuring out how to make money without free labor. The Industrial Revolution began, and machines became one of those engines of unpaid labor. There were people who were making money deceitfully. We refer to them as robber barons. These were people who bent the law in a way that could make them money. And then there were poor people who lived in such difficult situations that they would work for very little pay. They lacked education and social connections, which prevented them from being able to change their circumstances. Vida grew up in this time period. She grew up attending the Congregational Church, and at 14 years old, she was confirmed an Episcopalian. She was well educated and came from a family with money, but she decided to give her life to working with the poor. Jesus had worked with the poor. She saw working with the poor as a way to live out the two greatest commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. In Boston, there was something called tenement housing for the poor, where a whole family lived in one room. Can you imagine? 5 kids and 2 parents, eating, sleeping, bathing, cooking, washing dishes and clothes, all in one room. Where are the toys? Where are the books? Where is the time to learn and question and care for other people? Vida had a love for people, and this opened her eyes to see the needs of people that she saw around her. She began to visit tenement housing in Boston, finding there many immigrants living in places that had unsafe and unhealthy conditions. Some of the tenement housing was located by train tracks that produced a lot of soot from coal, making the air unsafe for those who lived there. She learned from other Christians like John Ruskin and Walter Rauschenbusch and the Salvation Army. She began to discover that her faith grew the more that she needed it. This is what Jesus had shown her in the Gospels. When he asked people to come and follow him, their faith grew. Vida gave up her own security to follow Jesus into the difficult places, visiting people who were poor and sick. Like the scribe in our gospel lesson today, she remembered that loving one's neighbor was, quote, more important than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. You see, back in Jesus' day, people showed their faith by carrying out various rituals, kind of like us. But they often forgot to love one another, kind of like us. God always calls us to love one another. In the entire Bible, you will see God challenge people again and again who say that they love God, but they don't address the needs of their neighbor. Listen to the prophet Isaiah's words as he speaks for God. Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day and oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with a wicked fist. Is this not the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke, to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin. Vida took this instruction to heart. She learned from the poor. They had ideas of how to solve their problems. Working alongside them, she reached out to the rich and educated people that she knew. She didn't just want the rich people's money. She wanted the system to change. She wanted their help in changing institutions which were blindly oppressing people. And so she joined with other women in creating the Dennison House in 1892. This was a settlement house where she lived most of the year. Other women who worked there included Nobel Prize winner Emily Green Balch, labor organizer Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, and pioneering aviator Amelia Earhart. I bet that's a name you know. The original site at 93 Tyler Street is a stop on the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. According to my research, the Dennison House's mission was to provide Boston's poor with social services and education, not only for philanthropic purposes, but to break down class barriers. The women hoped that bringing people of different backgrounds together under one roof would further the purpose of democracy, which they defined as, quote, a free-flowing life between group and group. Dennison House served as home base for several trade unions and provided as many as 1,500 people a week, that's 1,500 people a week, with employment assistance, English classes, childcare, and manual training. Do you see the photo of kids in a kindergarten class? This is at Dennison House. Another role model that I want to introduce to you is the Reverend Paul Washington. He was born in 1921 in Charleston, South Carolina. You can probably guess from this first slide about him of why I think that he's so important. Father Paul was the rector of the Church of the Advocate in Philadelphia. This church is where women were first ordained. Women's ordination was a big deal in the Episcopal Church. Some of the older people in our church probably remember what a big deal it was. Anybody here want to raise their hand if you were alive in 1974 as a grown-up? Good. People had strong feelings about whether or not women should be ordained, and I have to say it was mostly clergy who had the strong feelings against women's ordination. The man who was the priest here at St. Stephen's during that time was against women's ordination. Believe it or not, there are still a few places in our Episcopal Church that don't support women's ordination. By 1974, Father Paul had led the Church of the Advocate for 12 years. The church had been known as a place that made space for social justice. The Church of the Advocate was an ethnically diverse congregation that sought to minister to its neighborhood in downtown Philadelphia. Stephanie Spellers describes this beautifully in her book, The Church Cracked Open. She talks about how it is that the Church of the Advocate came to her host the first ordination of 11 women. I want to read to you her words. She said, when the church discerned one of their own, a brilliant white organizer named Sue Hyatt, had a calling to the priesthood, Washington said yes. In the face of prohibitions against women's ordination, knowing it might cost him his priesthood, he acted as a supporter, listener, planner, and co-strategist. He said, quote, at that time I knew only one thing. A black priest in an aided parish had disobeyed his bishop, the presiding bishop, and the General Convention, in an action that was broadcast to the world. I was in trouble. This was truly the lowest and perhaps the loneliest moment in my life, end quote. But he kept going, because he also understood that the civil disobedience of the 1960s had prepared them for this act of ecclesiastical disobedience. On July 29, 1976, the feast of Saints Mary and Martha, at the feasts of Saints Mary and Martha, Washington and the Advocate made Episcopal history by hosting the irregular priestly ordinations of a group of women known as the Philadelphia 11. 3 retired bishops performed the ordination. The critics raged, and the church took one step closer to the reign of God. It is hard to lead churches through difficult situations. It's hard to stand up for the right thing in a world that has different opinions. But Father Paul was quite familiar in taking a stand in social justice issues, even when it was unpopular, even when it was difficult, even when it required courage. He had been appointed to the Church of the Advocate in 1962 because it was a dwindling congregation. The bishop had appointed him there. It was located in a very troubled part of Philadelphia that was fraught with poverty and crime. The diocesan bishop hoped that Father Paul would lead his congregation to be a dynamic Episcopal presence in their community. And he indeed was convicted of that same. Again, Stephanie Spellers writes, Washington took that call and ran with it, straight into the arms of suffering people. It broke his heart, he said, when he saw poor and needy people, quote, treated like trash, blamed for being poor, dehumanized, and always kept waiting. He made up his mind early on that he would not participate in the dehumanization of his struggling neighbors. If you want to hear him speak about this, there's a recording on our church's website, the Episcopal Church's website, an interview with him on how he spoke up to change the dehumanization that he saw around him. It's a 6-minute audio recording, and you can access it by going to episcopalchurch.org. The Church Awakens. Indeed, that is what we are called to do. Throughout the Bible, God calls God's people to wake up and to notice what is around them and to respond to those needs. Hear the words of the prophet Zechariah as he spoke the words of the Lord. The word of the Lord came to Zechariah, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, render true judgments, show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the orphan, the alien, or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. You might remember in Matthew's gospel that Jesus says to those who challenge his faith, Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Loving your neighbor is more sacrificial than any burnt offering than anyone can make. And it is a sacrifice that demonstrates God's mercy and love. Tomorrow is All Saints' Day, and these 2 people, Vida and Paul, show us what it looks like to let God's love grow in our hearts. Their stories are remarkable, but what's remarkable is that they let God's love grow in them. The work that they did was challenging and hard, but they were empowered through the love of God that had taken root within them. And so they weren't pretending on the outside. It came up right through the center of their being, and it made it possible for them to be more than they could have ever imagined. And isn't that what a saint is? Someone who demonstrates the grace of God, which makes possible things which are impossible. It sounds like a miracle to me. So on this day, as we celebrate All Hallows Eve, let us take a moment to recognize All Saints' Day tomorrow. And know that the invitation for us to put on Christ is not an act of pretending, but an invitation to grow more like him through the very heart of our being. Amen.